They laughed at me. At the HOA meeting, neighbors whispered, "Squatter," and "Coward," while Karen, their proud president, waved eviction papers like a queen delivering judgment. They thought I was weak. They thought silence meant defeat. But what they didn't know was that the quiet man they mocked, the one living alone in that cabin, had once held more power than any of them could imagine. And when the truth finally came out, their laughter turned to silence. I'll never forget the day the humiliation began. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind when the town hall filled with restless neighbors, and the HOA board sat at their long table like judges deciding the fate of our lives. The air inside that hall was heavy with whispers, folded arms, and the smell of burnt coffee from a pot that had been simmering all afternoon. I walked in quietly, slipping into one of the back chairs, unnoticed at first. I had no entourage, no allies. Just me in a plain jacket, a worn notebook under my arm, and the calm of someone who knew patience was often the sharpest weapon. But patience wasn't what the HOA crowd wanted from me. They wanted a spectacle. And leading that charge was none other than Karen, the HOA president. Her sharp heels clicked across the polished floor as she strutted to the podium, papers clutched like evidence in a trial. "There he is," she announced loudly, pointing toward me as if unveiling a criminal. "The cabin squatter. The man who thinks he's above our rules." The words hung in the air, and a ripple of laughter rose from the front rows. A few neighbors smirked, others exchanged knowing glances, while the board members leaned back, enjoying the show. Karen was in her element, performing. I sat still, keeping my face unreadable. Inside, I felt the sting of every mocking glance, but years of discipline had taught me that silence, held long enough, unsettled bullies more than 1,000 outbursts. Karen slapped a stack of papers on the podium. "This so-called homeowner has been living on land that doesn't comply with our association codes. He's ignored landscaping standards, refused to submit architectural plans, and worse, he's occupied that cabin illegally for years. The board has no choice but to move forward with his eviction." There was no formal trial, no respect for due process. Just Karen's booming voice, the self-appointed queen of order, declaring me guilty without ever letting me speak. The whispers grew louder now, each word a dagger of judgment. "Didn't pay his dues. Squatter. Probably doesn't even belong here." I kept my hands folded on my lap, my gaze fixed on the papers she waved like swords. The injustice burned in my chest, but I let it simmer instead of spilling over. They didn't know me, and that ignorance was their comfort. Karen leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dripping with arrogance. "We're giving him 1 week to vacate. If not, we will pursue legal action and have the sheriff remove him. Rules are rules, after all." The crowd chuckled, clapping at her final line as though she had delivered a punchline. A few board members shook their heads at me with pity, others with disdain. I was the underdog, cornered in a public forum, stripped of dignity for everyone's entertainment. But what none of them knew, not Karen, not the board, not the neighbors who found pleasure in my embarrassment, was that I had heard words like these before. I had seen arrogance dress itself as authority and tear down good people without remorse. And I had spent my life not only standing against it, but judging it from the highest bench in the county courthouse. Still, in that moment, I let the humiliation continue. I let them smirk. I let Karen bask in her power. Because when arrogance builds too high, it collapses under its own weight. Karen raised her chin, savoring the applause from a few HOA loyalists. "Let this be a warning," she said, her eyes sweeping the room but pausing on me. "No one is above this community's rules. Not him, not anyone." Her words struck like gavel blows. The arrogance was absolute, and the room buzzed with self-satisfaction. People turned their eyes on me as if waiting for an outburst, a desperate plea, some crack in my calm. But I gave them nothing. I stood slowly, adjusting my jacket, and walked out with deliberate steps. Behind me, the sound of muffled laughter followed, like hyenas circling prey they thought too weak to fight back. Outside, the night air was sharp, cutting through the heat of that hall. I paused on the steps, looking at the glow of the cabin lights down the hill, my home, the place my family built with sweat and sacrifice. They thought I was defenseless, that I would bow to their threats. But humiliation is a curious thing. To those who wield it, it feels like victory. To those who endure it, it becomes fuel. And as I stood there, letting the cold wind steady my breath, one thought kept running through my mind. She doesn't know who she's humiliating. Karen had no idea the quiet man she mocked tonight was the same judge who had once presided over the most painful chapter of her life, her own divorce. And soon, the irony would be more public than her theatrics could ever prepare her for. This was only the beginning. The morning after that meeting, I woke up in my cabin to the sound of silence. Not the comforting kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence of being watched. Out my front window, parked at the edge of the gravel road, was Karen's silver SUV. She didn't even try to hide her surveillance. It sat there like a predator waiting for the slightest slip, ready to pounce. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at my wooden table, staring at the cup in my hands. Most people in this community thought of me as a recluse, a man with no friends, no family, no importance beyond that small log cabin tucked into the trees. They saw a worn jacket, weathered hands, and a man who didn't speak much. And in their world, silence meant weakness. But silence had always been my armor. It was what carried me through a life most of them could never imagine. Years ago, before I retired to this cabin, my life had been consumed by a courtroom. Not as a defendant, not as an attorney scraping by, but as the one man everyone addressed as Your Honor. I had presided over hundreds of cases, each one a window into the darkest corners of human behavior. I'd seen arrogance destroy marriages, greed tear families apart, and entitlement crush communities. And through it all, I learned that the people who screamed the loudest were often the ones with the most to lose. Karen was no different. But they didn't know that here. They only saw me as a man who never attended the block parties, never decorated for the holidays, never bent to their endless HOA demands. They mistook solitude for shame, dignity for defeat. What they couldn't see was the years I had sacrificed behind that bench. My wife had passed while I was still working 12-hour days, chasing justice in cases that kept me chained to the courthouse. My son had grown up in my absence, choosing to serve overseas rather than linger in a house where his father was a ghost. By the time I stepped down, the robe felt heavier than my body could bear. I left it behind, traded the marble halls for pinewood walls, and sought peace in this cabin that my grandfather once built with his own hands. But peace, it seemed, was a foreign language to the HOA. Karen's SUV finally rolled away, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time. Later that day, a letter appeared in my mailbox, another notice of violation. This time, it claimed my porch railing was 2 inches higher than the association allowed. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so deliberate. Each letter was a blade, meant to cut away at my patience until I either bent or broke. Neighbors began to treat me differently. The man who once nodded politely at me on morning walks now looked away. A couple who had borrowed tools from me last winter pretended not to hear my greeting. That's how HOA power worked. Fear and humiliation seeped through the cracks, turning ordinary people into silent accomplices. At the grocery store, I overheard Karen's voice carrying across the aisles. "He'll be gone soon," she told another board member, her tone smug. "Men like him can't stand pressure. He doesn't belong here anyway." I kept walking, pushing my cart, pretending the canned goods on the shelf were suddenly fascinating. On the outside, I looked like a man too beaten to care. On the inside, the words were chiseling into stone, becoming part of something much larger. Because what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had endured worse than gossip and notices. I had survived death threats from criminals who wanted me silenced. I had buried my own grief under the weight of justice. I had lived through nights where the knock at my door could have been the end of me. Compared to that, Karen's theatrics were little more than a nuisance. Still, the tension grew. Each day brought a new petty humiliation, a neighbor photographing my cabin from the road, anonymous complaints about noise when I hadn't even turned on a radio, trash left deliberately at the edge of my driveway. It was death by 1,000 cuts, orchestrated by a woman who thrived on control. And yet, I let it play out. Because every humiliation was a rope she tied tighter around her own neck. Every notice, every sneer, every public insult, each one was evidence of her arrogance, proof of her unchecked abuse of power. And when the time came to reveal who I really was, those ropes would snap back around her with a force she couldn't escape. For now, though, I wore my silence like armor. The neighbors thought I was an underdog, cornered and powerless. Karen thought I was just another man she could bully into submission. But beneath the quiet exterior, beneath the worn jacket and weary face, lived a man who had seen empires of arrogance crumble with a single stroke of his pen. And soon, they would all see it too. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the air was charged like a storm about to break. Word had spread quickly after the last gathering, about the squatter, the rule breaker, the man who supposedly thought he was above the law. Neighbors who once ignored HOA meetings now showed up in droves, hungry for spectacle. I walked into the hall just as the board was settling in. Every seat was filled, and people lined the back wall with folded arms and expectant grins. The buzz of conversation hushed the moment I stepped through the door. Dozens of eyes followed me, some full of mockery, others with curiosity, but all fixed like I was a criminal awaiting judgment. Karen wasted no time. She stood, smoothing the lapels of her tailored jacket, and flashed a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice booming through the microphone, "thank you for coming. Tonight, we will address an issue that threatens the very foundation of our community's integrity. Theatrical. Practiced. Every syllable designed to humiliate." Her gaze swept toward me, then lingered with feigned pity. "This man," she said, pointing as though she were presenting evidence in a trial, "continues to defy our rules. He occupies property that doesn't meet our standards, refuses to comply with citations, and now, get this, has openly ignored our eviction notice." Gasps rippled across the room. Some neighbors whispered, covering their mouths. A younger man in the corner raised his phone and began recording, tilting the screen to capture both Karen and me in the same frame. The crowd wanted drama, and Karen was feeding them generously. She leaned closer to the mic. "When one person refuses to follow the rules, it undermines all of us. Why should you pay your dues, keep your lawns trimmed, repaint your fences, when he refuses and gets away with it?" The crowd rumbled in agreement. A woman in the front row muttered loud enough to be heard, "He thinks he's special." Another added, "Probably hasn't paid in years." The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were daggers thrown into the open. Karen, sensing her power, turned up the heat. She strutted to the edge of the platform, heels clicking in rhythm with her words. "I propose we take a vote tonight, right here, right now. Do we let him keep disrespecting us, or do we show him that this community will not tolerate lawlessness?" The room erupted. Cheers, claps, even laughter. One man shouted, "Throw him out." Another raised his hand eagerly, as though eviction was some kind of sport. Phones lit up across the hall, recording every second of the humiliation. And me. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, face unreadable. My calm only fueled their frenzy. Karen tilted her head, narrowing her eyes, clearly unsettled by my composure. She wanted anger. She wanted me to lash out, to beg, to confirm the image she had painted of me. Instead, I gave her nothing. She smiled again, but this time it wavered. "Well," she said, "since you seem unwilling to speak for yourself, I'll speak for you. You don't belong here. You don't respect the community. And frankly, you don't deserve that cabin." The crowd roared. Some laughed outright, others clapped as though she had delivered a victory speech. The young man with the phone zoomed in on me, capturing my silence as if it proved my guilt. Every insult, every whisper, every laugh was another nail they thought they were hammering into my coffin. Karen leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with triumph. "If you have anything to say for yourself, now's your chance. Defend your so-called rights. Or admit, in front of everyone here, that you're just a coward hiding behind 4 rotten walls. The room quieted, anticipation thick as fog. All eyes were on me now. Slowly, I lifted my gaze from the table and let it sweep across the room. I saw the smirks, the raised eyebrows, the neighbors leaning forward like spectators at a coliseum waiting for blood. My calm unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. I didn't speak. I simply met their eyes, one by one, and then turned my attention back to Karen. The silence stretched, long and deliberate, until whispers began to stir again. "Why won't he talk?" someone hissed. "Is he guilty?" another asked. Even the man recording lowered his phone slightly, disappointed that I hadn't snapped. Karen cleared her throat, her confidence faltering for just a moment. She wasn't used to enemies who didn't play her game. But then she recovered, slamming her gavel against the table. "Fine," she said. "If he won't defend himself, then let the record show, this man has no defense. He is guilty of violating our community, and we will proceed with eviction." The gavel cracked like thunder. The crowd cheered again, eager for a decision that felt like justice but was really just arrogance in disguise. I stood slowly, the weight of their laughter pressing against me, but my steps steady, my face calm. The cameras caught it all, the smirks, the jeers, the triumphant smile on Karen's face. And yet, beneath their noise, the suspense only grew. They didn't know why I was so calm. They didn't know why I didn't fight back. They didn't know that every insult, every recorded sneer, every mocking word was building toward something far larger than they could imagine. As I walked out of that hall once again, their laughter followed me into the night. But behind their arrogance, I could hear it, the faintest crack in their certainty, the uneasy whisper of curiosity. Who was this man, really? And soon enough, they would find out. The day of reckoning arrived faster than anyone expected. Karen, eager to prove her authority, filed official papers with the county clerk to force my eviction. She didn't realize that such documents always found their way across the desk of the judiciary. And though I had retired from the bench months earlier, the courthouse was still my second home. I knew every clerk, every deputy, every file room better than I knew the back of my hand. So when the hearing was scheduled, an open HOA dispute case, I didn't argue. I didn't dodge. I showed up. The community hall had been converted into a courtroom for the occasion, rows of chairs filled with neighbors who came to watch my downfall. Phones were already out, recording before the gavel even struck. Karen stood at the front like a queen awaiting coronation, her lawyers lined beside her with smug confidence. "This won't take long," she whispered loudly enough for the first row to hear. "We'll have him out by the end of the week." The crowd chuckled, nodding, already convinced. The presiding judge was delayed, so the room buzzed with impatience. Karen seized the silence, marching to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "today we uphold our community's rules. This man has been nothing but a nuisance, a rule-breaker, a freeloader who thinks he can outsmart the HOA. But rules matter. And tonight, justice will prevail." The room applauded. Some even stood, clapping as though it were theater. Karen turned toward me, lips curling into a smirk. "You've had your chance to defend yourself. After today, you'll be packing your bags." I stood quietly near the back, hands folded, gaze steady. Not a word. Not yet. Then came the sound, the heavy doors at the end of the hall opening, footsteps echoing across the wood floor. The clerk entered, eyes scanning the room. "Your Honor," she called. And before anyone could process the words, she looked straight at me. The room went silent. Karen's smirk faltered as the clerk walked directly toward me, papers in hand. "Your Honor, here are the documents you requested for review." She placed them in my hands with the ease of routine, the respect of years of service. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. "Your Honor?" Heads turned, mouths gaped. The man they thought was a squatter, the one mocked and ridiculed, was suddenly addressed with a title none of them had ever imagined. I didn't rush. I let the silence hang. I walked slowly to the front of the room, each step punctuated by gasps and murmurs. When I reached the podium, I placed the papers down and finally spoke. "My name," I said, my voice calm but carrying across the hall, "is Judge Marcus Holloway. I spent 30 years on the bench in this county, and for the past several months, I have watched as this association, led by Mrs. Karen Whitmore, has tried to strip me of rights I know better than anyone." The room erupted. Some neighbors covered their mouths in disbelief, others fumbled with their phones, scrambling to keep recording. The same people who had laughed now stared as though the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Karen staggered back, her face draining of color. You can't," she stammered. I lifted one of the papers she had filed. "This eviction notice," I said, holding it high, "is not only invalid, but fraudulent. And the signatures here," I turned it so the crowd could see, "bear the mark of a president who has abused her position for personal vendettas. Abuse of authority. Harassment. Retaliation." Every word was a gavel strike. The whispers turned to a roar of chaos. Some shouted in shock, others in anger. Phones flashed, capturing every second of the revelation. And then I dropped the final blow. Some of you may recall a certain divorce proceeding, not long ago. The matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore. My eyes met Karen's, steady and unflinching. I was the judge who presided over that case. I was the one who signed the decree that ended her marriage. Gasps exploded through the hall. Karen's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table as if it might hold her upright. Her arrogance evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw, unmasked fear. The silence that followed was deafening. No laughter, no jeers, no whispers, just stunned disbelief hanging in the air. I continued, calm but resolute. I sought peace in this cabin after a lifetime of service. I asked for nothing but quiet. Instead, I was met with harassment, humiliation, and illegal attempts to strip me of my home. But let this be clear, I will not be evicted. Not now. Not ever. The crowd shifted uneasily, the same people who mocked me now unable to meet my gaze. Phones trembled in hands as they captured a scene no one had expected. Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked. This is unfair," she cried, but the words sounded hollow, pathetic, drowned out by the weight of truth. I let the silence answer her. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped entirely. The underdog was no longer prey. The judge had stepped out of the shadows, and the queen of arrogance had been stripped of her crown. And every single person in that room knew it. The silence that followed my revelation seemed endless. The entire hall, once buzzing with jeers and laughter, had frozen into a tableau of disbelief. Faces that only moments earlier had smirked with arrogance now looked pale and stiff, as if someone had pulled the ground out from beneath them. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner, a low mechanical drone against the thick weight of truth. Karen's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the table. The papers she had brandished so confidently before now lay scattered across the floor, forgotten relics of her crumbling authority. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching desperately for an ally, but the crowd that had cheered her on was no longer hers. They had turned, silently, instinctively, toward me. I did not gloat. I did not smile. Years of sitting behind the bench had taught me that justice loses its weight when it becomes personal vengeance. Instead, I lifted the fraudulent eviction notice again, holding it steady for all to see. "This document," I said, voice calm and measured, "was filed under false pretenses. It contains violations not only of HOA regulations, but of state law. Any lawyer in this room could tell you that. But Karen knew her audience. She thought your laughter would drown out the truth. She thought my silence was weakness." A murmur rippled through the hall. Someone whispered, "He's a judge." Another answered, "No wonder he never said anything." The same neighbors who had once avoided my gaze now stared at me with something close to respect, or perhaps guilt. Karen tried to recover, her voice cracking as she stammered, This isn't fair. You're manipulating them. You can't still have authority here. You're retired." I let her words hang for a moment before responding. Authority doesn't vanish with retirement, Mrs. Whitmore. Knowledge doesn't disappear. Integrity doesn't expire. And your record here tonight, every word, every attempt at public humiliation, is evidence of abuse. Not just against me, but against anyone in this community who dared to resist your control. I stepped back from the podium, giving the room space to absorb it. That was when the whispers grew louder, shocked exclamations, disbelieving laughter, even applause from the back row. One neighbor stood, clapping slowly at first, then others joined, their hands echoing against the walls. Karen's face twisted, horror replacing her arrogance. The applause wasn't for her anymore. It was for the man she had tried to humiliate. I raised a hand gently, quieting the room. This is not about applause, I said firmly. It is about accountability. We cannot allow a homeowners association, or any authority, to twist rules into weapons. If it can happen to me, it can happen to any of you. Heads nodded. The same people who once whispered against me now whispered against her. She went too far. We trusted her. What else has she done? The tide had shifted, and Karen could feel it drowning her. One of the board members cleared his throat nervously. Judge Holloway, he hesitated on the title but said it anyway. What happens now? I looked directly at him. What happens now, I said, is that this association cleans house. Records will be audited. Complaints will be reviewed. Every notice filed under this leadership will be re-examined. And if necessary, law enforcement will be notified of fraudulent filings. Karen gasped, slamming her palm on the table. You can't do this to me, she shrieked, but her voice cracked under the weight of the truth. You're not in charge here. I met her glare with quiet certainty. I don't need to be in charge. The law is. The words landed heavier than any gavel I had ever struck. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided Karen's eyes altogether. One, the treasurer, leaned forward and whispered something sharp in her ear. She jerked back, face reddening with fury, but her allies were crumbling. They had backed her when they thought she was untouchable. Now, standing next to a man who had once decided cases that shaped lives, they saw her for what she was: small, desperate, cornered. Neighbors rose from their chairs, some applauding, others simply filing out with shaking heads. The man who had been recording from the corner kept his phone steady, capturing Karen's unraveling in real time. Later, that footage would spread faster than wildfire through the community. I stayed calm. No gloating. No smirk. Just the steady dignity of a man who had endured humiliation and returned it with truth. As I gathered the scattered papers from the floor, I spoke one last time. Let this moment be a lesson. Power is not control. Power is responsibility. And respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. The applause rose again, louder this time, echoing off the hall's rafters. Karen sank into her chair, pale and shaking, as the crowd turned their backs on her. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of injustice lift from my shoulders. Not because I had won, but because the truth had finally broken through the noise. And justice, as it always does, had begun to unfold. When the meeting finally adjourned, the air inside that hall felt entirely different than when it began. Gone were the mocking whispers, the stifled laughter, the gleeful anticipation of my downfall. In their place lingered silence, awkward and heavy, broken only by the scraping of chairs as neighbors rose from their seats. The very people who had once averted their eyes from me now couldn't stop staring. Some looked embarrassed, cheeks red as they shuffled past. Others nodded with hesitant respect, murmuring apologies too soft to hear clearly. It didn't matter. I had no interest in their regret. What mattered was that the truth had revealed itself, and arrogance had finally met its end. Karen sat slumped in her chair, shoulders bent as though the weight of her own pride had crushed her. The confidence that once fueled her tirades had drained completely, leaving only a shell of desperation. Her board members avoided her gaze, whispering urgently among themselves, their loyalty evaporating in the heat of public disgrace. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, moving with deliberate calm. Every movement was slow, unhurried, as though to remind them all that I was in control without ever having to raise my voice. Years on the bench had taught me this rhythm. Power wasn't in the noise, but in the stillness that followed it. As I walked toward the exit, a ripple moved through the crowd. Some clapped softly, unsure if applause was appropriate in a setting meant for judgment. Others offered their hands, tentative handshakes of respect from neighbors who had once treated me like an outcast. A few simply stepped aside, bowing their heads in acknowledgement. Outside, the night air was cool against my face. The crickets chirped in steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just left behind. I paused on the steps, letting the calm settle over me. Behind me, the crowd spilled out of the hall, their voices hushed now, stripped of arrogance. A man I barely knew, one who had once glared at me during morning walks, approached nervously. "Judge," he said softly, almost testing the word on his tongue. I didn't know. I shouldn't have." His voice trailed off into shame. I nodded once, sparing him from further apology. "Respect doesn't come from knowing titles," I said evenly. "It comes from how you treat people when you think they have none." He lowered his head, words caught in his throat. Then he walked away. In the days that followed, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who once mocked me now waved politely, sometimes stopping to chat with forced friendliness. The same couple who had pretended not to hear my greetings now brought me fresh bread as a neighborly gesture. Even the younger families, who had once recorded my humiliation for entertainment, now looked away sheepishly whenever our paths crossed. But I neither sought nor celebrated their change of heart. Respect gained through revelation is not the same as respect freely given. What mattered to me was that the HOA's reign of arrogance had been broken. Karen, meanwhile, was stripped of her position within the week. The board called an emergency session, reviewing the evidence I had presented. Her fraudulent filings, her targeted harassment, her misuse of authority, all of it was laid bare. The same board that once echoed her arrogance now voted unanimously to remove her from power. I did not attend that meeting. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't always require the presence of the one wronged. Sometimes, it requires only that the truth be undeniable. Back at my cabin, life returned to its quiet rhythm. The cabin lights glowed warm against the night, the smell of pine filled the air, and for the first time in months, I felt the true weight of peace. I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set beyond the tree line, when a thought crossed my mind. Karen's downfall had never been my victory. My victory was my silence, my patience, my refusal to let arrogance pull me into its theater. In the end, it was her own pride that destroyed her. And as the stars blinked awake in the dark sky, I felt the truth settle deep into me. Respect is not won by titles, or by fear, or by power. It is won by endurance, by calm in the storm, by dignity when all else fails. The neighbors had learned their lesson. Karen had lost her throne. And I had regained the quiet I sought all along. The underdog they mocked had never been an underdog at all. When I look back on everything that happened, the whispers, the laughter, the eviction threats, the arrogance displayed so proudly in that hall, I realize the story was never about one woman's pettiness or one board's corruption. It was about something far larger, something that reaches into every neighborhood, every workplace, every corner of human life. Arrogance is a mask. It shouts loudly to cover its own fear. It humiliates others to hide its own weakness. And in those meetings, in those long weeks of harassment, Karen believed she was untouchable because everyone around her treated silence as weakness. She mistook dignity for defeat. She mistook patience for cowardice. But silence has its own power. Patience has its own strength. And truth, no matter how long it is buried under arrogance and noise, always finds its way to the surface. That night when the hall fell silent, when the crowd who once mocked me turned their eyes downward in shame, was not just about me being revealed as a judge. It was about every person in that room learning something they should have known all along. Never underestimate the quiet one. Never assume that a man in plain clothes, living in a modest cabin, is powerless. Never assume that because someone doesn't flaunt their strength, they don't possess it. True power is not loud. True power does not humiliate. True power is silent, steady, and revealed only when it must be. I did not fight Karen with shouting or threats. I didn't try to outmatch her arrogance with my own. I endured. I listened. I let her arrogance stack up, piece by piece, until it was so tall it had no choice but to collapse under its own weight. And when the truth finally came, it wasn't my anger that destroyed her, it was her own pride. That is the lesson I hope lingers. Because every community has its Karens. Every workplace, every school, every corner of life has someone who mistakes control for leadership, who believes dominance is respect. They push, they mock, they humiliate, and the world seems to cheer them on. Until, one day, the truth steps forward, calmly, quietly, undeniably, and the game ends. Respect is not about appearances. It is not about titles on paper, or the car in the driveway, or the size of a house. Respect is about how you treat people when you think they have nothing. It is about kindness when no one is watching, patience when no one else has it, dignity when others are trying to strip it away. I sought peace when I came to that cabin. I wanted nothing more than quiet after years of service, years of sacrifice, years of giving every ounce of myself to justice. And even in my search for peace, arrogance tried to invade. But I learned something vital. Peace is not something you are given. It is something you defend, not with anger, but with patience, with truth, with quiet endurance. Karen lost more than her position. She lost the illusion she had built around herself. She lost the crowd that once cheered for her cruelty. And perhaps most painfully, she lost the respect that no title, no vote, no authority could ever give her back. As for me, I gained nothing new, only what I had all along. Dignity, patience, truth. And in the end, that was enough. So let this story remind you, whoever you are, wherever you find yourself, never underestimate the one who stays silent while others shout. Never mistake calm for weakness. Never mistake humility for insignificance. Because true power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand to be recognized. It waits, steady and patient, until the moment comes when silence must be broken. And when it does, it doesn't just humble arrogance, it shatters it. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Honor is not given. It is earned through sacrifice. Respect is not demanded. It is inspired through character. And justice, though it may take its time, always arrives. That is the legacy I carry. That is the truth Karen and the HOA had to learn the hard way. And if you carry that lesson with you, if you learn to see beyond appearances, if you learn to respect quietly, if you learn to never underestimate anyone, then maybe, just maybe, you'll never find yourself on the wrong side of silence. Because silence, when it finally speaks, is the loudest sound in the world.